In 1871, in a single building, on a single night, 5 men were shot dead before anyone had a chance to draw their weapon. Not in a war, not in an ambush, inside a saloon, in a town you've probably never heard of. The place was called Tuttle's Dance Hall and Saloon. The town was Newton, Kansas. And what happened there on the night of August 19th, 1871, was so violent, so sudden, and so shocking that newspapers across America called it the bloodiest night in the history of the American West. This is the story of the Newton General Massacre. The night that proved one thing beyond any doubt, that there was no place more dangerous in the entire American West than the inside of the wrong saloon. This is Untold America, and this is the story they never told you. To understand what made Tuttle's Saloon so dangerous, you need to understand what the American West actually was in 1871. Not the version Hollywood sold you, the real one. Newton, Kansas in 1871 was the wildest cattle town in America. Every summer, hundreds of thousands of longhorn cattle were driven north from Texas along the Chisholm Trail, straight into Newton, where they were loaded onto rail cars and shipped east. And with those cattle drives came the cowboys. Thousands of them. Young men, armed men, men who had spent 3 months on the trail with nothing but dust, heat, rattlesnakes, and each other. Men who arrived in Newton with their wages in their pocket and their tempers at boiling point. And the people waiting for them in Newton were not the lawmen and preachers from the history books. They were gamblers, confidence men, liquor merchants, and men who made their living separating trail-worn cowboys from their wages before sundown. Newton in 1871 had one church. It had 27 saloons. The Frontier Saloon was not simply a bar. It was everything. The bank, the courthouse, the hotel, the gambling hall, the place where land deals were made, and where those same deals were settled with a bullet when they went wrong. The average Frontier Saloon saw at least one violent death every single month. Most saw far more. But in all of the American West, in every cattle town, every mining camp, every railroad terminus from Texas to Montana, no single building ever came close to what happened at Tuttle's Dance Hall on the night of August 19th. Stay with me. Tuttle's Dance Hall and Saloon sat on South Main Street in Newton, the stretch of road that the locals had already started calling Hyde Park. Hyde Park was where the violence lived. The building itself was a 2-story wooden structure, like every other building on the frontier. Raw timber, sawdust floors, a long bar running the length of the ground floor, tables for gambling in the back, a raised platform at one end for the musicians, and upstairs, rooms, the kind you didn't ask too many questions about. Perry Tuttle ran the place. He was a businessman first, which in Newton in 1871 meant he was willing to serve anyone with money in his pocket and ignore whatever happened afterward. The whiskey he sold was not the smooth bourbon you might imagine. It was gut rot, raw frontier liquor that smelled of turpentine and hit a man like a hammer behind the eyes. It cost a dime a glass. Cowboys could drink themselves into a stupor for less than $1. Most of them tried. By the summer of 1871, Newton had become the most dangerous cattle town in America. And Tuttle's was the most dangerous saloon in Newton. Not because Perry Tuttle wanted it that way, but because of what the cattle drives brought with them. Newton had no real law enforcement. The town marshal spent more time inside the saloons than patrolling outside them. Every man on the street carried a gun. Most carried 2. It was a powder keg, and the fuse had a name. His name was Hugh Anderson, a Texas cowboy, 22 years old, and he was carrying a grudge that had been building all summer. Stay with me, because what he did on the night of August 19th changed everything. Anderson had driven cattle north to Newton that summer with a trail crew from Texas. A group of men who were tight-knit, loyal to each other, and not inclined to forgive an insult. A few weeks before the massacre, Anderson had a violent confrontation with a Newton lawman named Mike McCluskey. The details of that original dispute are murky, but what is certain is that it involved money, alcohol, and the kind of frontier pride that men in 1871 considered worth dying for. Anderson had been biding his time, waiting. On the night of August 19th, he decided the waiting was over. Mike McCluskey was the kind of man the frontier produced in abundance, and the history books largely forgot. He worked as a special policeman for the Santa Fe Railroad. He was hard, capable, not above violence when he thought it was warranted. He was also, by the accounts of those who knew him, genuinely fearless, which on the night of August 19, 1871, turned out to be both his greatest strength and the reason he died. The third man you need to know is Jim Riley. Riley was a young cowboy, barely out of his teens. He had ridden north from Texas with Anderson's crew. He was Anderson's friend. But Jim Riley had something that very few men on the frontier had. Something that would make him the most terrifying man in Tuttle's saloon on the night of the massacre. He was dying. Jim Riley had consumption, what we now call tuberculosis. He knew it. Everyone who rode with him knew it. In 1871, a diagnosis of consumption was a death sentence. It was only a matter of when. And a dying man with a loaded revolver and a grudge is the most dangerous thing in any room. It is late on a Saturday night in August. Tuttle's dance hall is packed. The cattle drives have been good this summer. Money moving at the bar, at the gambling tables, in the back rooms upstairs. The fiddle player is working through his third hour. Nobody notices Hugh Anderson walk in. Anderson moves through the crowd. He finds McCluskey at the bar, and he shoots him. The first bullet takes McCluskey in the side. He falls, but doesn't go down. McCluskey, who was genuinely fearless, remember, draws his own weapon. The saloon explodes. Within 30 seconds, every armed man in Tuttle's dance hall has drawn. That meant almost every man in the building. And then, Jim Riley comes through the door. What happened next was described by every surviving witness in exactly the same way. Riley, pale, thin, barely able to ride a horse properly with a consumption eating away at his lungs, walked into the middle of the gunfight without flinching. He drew both revolvers, and he started shooting everything that moved. Riley shot 5 men in the span of 90 seconds. 5 men who had come to Tuttle's that Saturday night for whiskey and cards, and a few hours away from the trail. 4 of them died before sunrise. McCluskey died on the saloon floor that night. Hugh Anderson, the man who fired the first shot, was wounded but survived. He fled Newton on horseback before dawn and was never brought to justice. When the shooting stopped, there were bodies on the floor of Tuttle's dance hall. 5 dead, 3 more wounded, in a single building, in a single night, in a town that had been founded just 2 years earlier. Newspapers across the country ran the story the following week. The St. Louis Democrat called it the bloodiest night in the history of the American cattle towns. The Kansas newspapers simply called it the Newton General Massacre. The name stuck. But what happened after the massacre is just as dark as the massacre itself. Stay with me, because the town's response to 5 dead men reveals something about the American West that most history books will never tell you. Here is the part of the Newton General Massacre that should stop you cold. Nobody was ever charged. Nobody was ever tried. Nobody was ever convicted. Hugh Anderson, who fired the first shot, rode out of Newton that night and disappeared into Texas. He was never arrested for what happened at Tuttle's saloon. He was never even formally wanted. Jim Riley, the dying man who shot 5 people, walked out of Tuttle's dance hall, and continued living in Newton for weeks afterward, openly, in the same town where he had just killed 4 men. He was never charged with anything. Why? Because in Newton, in 1871, the cattle business was worth more than the lives of the men who worked it. The town merchants, the railroad men, the landowners. They needed the cowboys to keep coming north every summer with their wages. Prosecuting the massacre would have meant trials, witnesses, disruption, bad press. Cowboys hearing that Newton was a dangerous town and taking their cattle and their money to Abilene or Wichita instead. So the bodies were buried. The floor was cleaned. Perry Tuttle reopened for business 3 days later. Tuttle's dance hall continued operating for another full season after the massacre. By 1872, Newton's moment as the dominant cattle town was fading. Ellsworth had taken over. The cowboys followed the cattle. The cattle followed the money. And Newton slowly became something that frontier towns rarely became: quiet. Tuttle's saloon eventually closed. The building was torn down. There is nothing on the site today that marks what happened there on the night of August 19, 1871. No plaque, no monument, no memorial. The 5 men who died in that saloon are buried in Newton's Greenwood Cemetery, most of them in graves that were unmarked for decades. The American West was very good at forgetting. It was built on the ability to move forward without looking back, which is exactly why places like Tuttle's Dance Hall disappeared from the history books. Not because the story wasn't worth telling, but because the people who could have told it had every reason not to. The story of Tuttle's Dance Hall is not really about one saloon, and it is not really about 5 men who died on a Saturday night in August. It is about what the American frontier actually was. Not the version with the heroic sheriffs and the honorable outlaws, and the bar fights that ended with someone dusting themselves off. The real version, where young men traveled thousands of miles in brutal conditions for wages that barely kept them alive, where the law was either absent, corrupt, or outgunned, where life was cheaper than the price of a bottle of gut-rot whiskey. There were over 100 cattle towns operating along the Kansas Railroad lines between 1867 and 1885. Every single one of them had a Tuttle's saloon. The history books gave you Dodge City and Tombstone and the gunfight at the OK Corral. They gave you Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday, and stories with heroes and villains clearly marked. What they did not give you was Newton. What they did not give you was Jim Riley, a dying man with 2 revolvers standing in the middle of a burning room with nothing left to lose. What they did not give you was 5 anonymous graves in a Kansas cemetery. What they did not give you was the truth. The 5 men who died in Tuttle's Dance Hall on the night of August 19, 1871, were not famous. They were not outlaws. They were not lawmen. They were not the kind of men the history books were built to remember. They were Billy Garrett, age 21, Henry Kearns, age 24, Jim Wilkerson, age unknown, and Mike McCluskey, who died defending himself in a fight he had not started and could not have finished. They came to Newton for the same reason everyone came to the frontier, for the chance of something better. And the frontier gave them the same thing it gave so many men who passed through it: an unmarked grave, and a story nobody told. That is what Untold America is here for. The stories they left out, the places they forgot, the men and women whose history was buried alongside them. This is the real America, the brutal, complicated, extraordinary America that your textbooks did not have space for. If this video gave you something, drop a comment right now. Tell me, did you know about the Newton General Massacre before today? Had you ever heard of Tuttle's Dance Hall? I read every comment on this channel and I reply to as many as I can. Subscribe if you want more of this. Every video on this channel goes deeper into the history they never taught you, the dark frontier, the real outlaws.